Hi guys, welcome back to Casting Commons, the show where we talk and discuss everything Pauper. I'm your host, Teasdale, and this is my co-host, the peanut butter cup himself, Reese.
Hi.
So pal, what have you been up to this week?
Some bits and pieces in different formats, to be honest. I
Blasphemy.
built up Bogles in paper for Pauper, and built it up on Modo, because I was missing like 0.037 ticks worth of cards or something, which was like 16 cards. So I've built those up. I've played a few tournament practices, but I'm going to give that a run through a couple of leagues hopefully this week. Tried Pioneer at F&M. That definitely wasn't the format for me. Like it didn't feel very fun at all. I just basically got comboed out constantly. And then I'm supposed to be testing for Legacy, but I've done zero testing. So I'm either going to YOLO it or just not play. I haven't quite decided yet.
I see.
Since all the Modern Horizons stuff, it just hasn't felt very fun.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in a similar position with any other non-Pauper format. It just feels not too exciting for me.
What have you been doing?
Everything Pauper, really. I think I finally got my groove sorted. I think I can finally balance everything to do with writing, editing and recording. So
Good.
That seems to be somewhat less chaotic. My main thing is I revisited Jeskai Affinity, a deck that I was messing about with before March of the Machine, probably before Brothers War as well. And it was essentially just like a Mardu Synth deck, Mardu Synth combined with Affinity, so you lost the black out of both, but then from Grixis Affinity side you effectively gained like an experimental synthesizer and Core Sky Fishery draw engine, and from the Mardu Synth side you gained Kenku, which was a big one, and it's been performing, to be honest. I've had quite a bit of success with it. The Core Sky Fisher experimental synthesizer engine's just still pretty good, definitely underexplored.
I imagine being able to back up the synth engine with like Thoughtcast and Murder Enforcers as well is probably pretty good.
Yeah, it's definitely proved pretty successful. The only issue I'm finding is sometimes is that there's no way to rebuy the Enforcers. It's pretty awkward to find that. Like that you could probably add like something like an Omen of the Dead with like Navigator's Compass and stuff. You could probably cast a few of them a couple of times, which might be okay. But yeah, I also played Monstertron. I finally ticked that off the list. That was fun. It was definitely a blast. I wouldn't probably play it regularly, but it was definitely a blast.
Yeah, it's a cool day.
Anyways, on to the stuff that everyone is definitely here for, and it is what happened in this wild weekend of the challenges. But there is also a bonus challenge, I guess. There is the Saturday Showcase Challenge, which, for those that don't know, it's a road to the Pro Tour and also the Magic Online Championships, which showcases every month, I believe. They are Modern, Legacy and Pioneer, and then there's a fourth showcase which rotates between Pauper, Vintage and Standard, and then this month we had Pauper. So anyone with enough qualifier points can basically join the Pauper Showcase.
And obviously that used to replace a challenge, but for some reason now just hasn't replaced a challenge. I don't know if that's an old change or not, I'm not sure, but we have essentially 3 challenges to talk about.
Exactly. So we'll look at the Saturday challenge first, the non-showcase, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. And we'll just fly through the top 8 as we usually do. So like the first place was Fair, realistically, and second was Ponza, which I'm all for. And third is Heroic, mono white Heroic. Then we've got Ponza. Then we have a 4-colour Gates, or a Gate Soup as people like to call it nowadays. Blue Black Terror, Affinity, and then Familiars, with a couple just missing out being is that Boros Gates, and another copy of FAMS. So
it's quite a cool looking top 8, to be fair. The double Ponza's very unexpected, especially second place
Yeah.
is a pretty amazing result for Ponza.
Yeah.
Obviously, a few weeks ago we seen that it had picked up a bit and then it sort of died off.
Yeah.
Obviously, for this challenge, it was back.
I was a week behind my prediction. I was a week behind.
Yeah. And yeah, quite a mixed top 8. No mono red, which is interesting, and no Bogles as well. But you do have that heroic.
Bogles is ugly sister.
Yeah, sort of Bogles, sort of not. But yeah, the affinity list was a bit more normalised as well than we seen last week. There was less sort of sideboard tech cards, as you might expect. Cut down on the nihil spell bombs in the main, no breath weapons in the main. So it had frogmites back in. But in general, affinity for that challenge, I think there was only 2 copies in the top 32, and one was that one in the top 8, which very low for affinity.
Definitely low. You usually see standard of 4 or so people at least piloting it, and most of the time they do top 32, but not this challenge.
Mono red as well, obviously, in a similar situation, very low, none in the top 8. I think the closest was 22nd.
Jesus.
So yeah, it was very far down with only 3 copies in the top 32, and 3 copies that were all very different lists. One was the sort of pinger burn that we spoke about last week.
Yeah.
Well, and probably the few weeks before that as well. And then the other 2, one had Forge Chanter in, and one had Forge Chanter and Burn and Profit in. So they're more of a prowessy spell slinger take.
I'm assuming all of them ran, was it 8? Ren's Resolve, I would guess.
Yeah, and no Kuldothers in any of them. But yeah, another slant on mono red. Obviously, didn't do too great, but it's there.
Good enough for top 32, but obviously.
Yeah.
I guess my thought is probably Forge Chanter may have carried that potentially. I would say, as it's kind of got pseudo hexproof or at least some form of protection, and it costs them, especially if you're looking at this top 8 or top 32, how many blue elemental blasts there are in the sideboards. Yeah. It seems like it's definitely helped being Forge Chanter, I guess, which is maybe the reason for the move towards a prowessy build as opposed to the Burn and Tree Kuldotha or the Pinger Burn as we.
Yeah, I guess versing the Cage Breaker, at least it costs them 2 life if you get it down to remove it rather than nothing. But yeah, interesting tweaks on mono red.
Yeah, it was definitely even low represented as well, because it was only I believe about 10% on this one. There was 5 pilots in the entire event, which is obviously really, really low for mono red. We had 30% last Saturday.
Yeah.
And it's now gone down to 5 people playing it, which is a bit odd.
Yeah, I'm not even sure why. I don't know if it's. Yeah, I actually don't know why. I don't know if it's because the lists haven't solidified and people just don't have the confidence on it, or it's because the amount of mono blue Fae that there is at the moment and blue black Terror. There's so many Hydroblasts and blue elemental blasts in basically every deck, not even in those in affinity sideboards, in gate sideboards. Maybe people just don't want to fight through those.
Yeah, I think speaking about last week, or touched on it a bit last week, I felt like it's either going to go one way or the other. I think is probably it with the red decks. Either everyone's going to accept that it's the best deck and just going to play it, or everyone's going to go to something else that is really good against the red decks. And more time, unless it's something ridiculously strong, I feel like a lot of people get sick of playing red and affinity that much that they'd rather play something that's got a reasonable matchup. As we've seen over the past few years, that they at least try to, when Black-White Ephemera took a big uptick not so long ago when Cold Author was really big and Affinity was really big because it had a great Affinity matchup in terms of it had sideboard Dust to Dusts, and it also gained a lot of life with its tap lands and its lone missionaries and its ephemerates. So I guess it's probably something along them lines. People just don't like to fold and play red and Affinity because everyone's played them for probably the last 3 to 5 years, roughly.
Yeah, I can see that. And the only other thing I've got on this is obviously there was no Bogles in the top 10, but there was 2 copies, 11th and 12th, so it only just missed. Bogles just super low pilots as usual, but super consistent results. Always getting like really well into the top 16, if not the top 8.
Yeah. That's definitely. I think I've kind of touched. It's kind of the similar vein of what obviously we've got to talk about in the showcase challenge, which we'll probably touch on later. My thoughts on why I think Bogles and also Terra, which are, I don't want to say the same, but they have similar pros and similar cons. I would say to the point where that I'll just touch on it there, but it's definitely a good contender at the moment.
Well, if we jump onto the showcase now, then, if you've got nothing else for the
Saturday challenge, nothing at all.
A bit more of a bit less of a varied top 8, I suppose. First and second was 2 Bogles decks. Third and fourth were Green Black Gardens and Mono Blue Fair, and then 5th through 8th was 3 Terra decks, all blue black, and a Flickertron.
Yeah.
And then the 2 near misses were another Gardens deck, and another blue black Terra deck.
But I believe the 9th place was the Gardens deck that won last week, right? The one that runs Visionary.
It was. Whereas the top 4 one didn't have Visionary. It was more like a traditional list.
As traditional as you can get with Gardens.
Yeah. But yeah, obviously a dramatically different top 8 from the Saturday.
Yeah.
With an absolute ton of Terra, and overall Terra was just really heavily represented in the showcase.
Yeah.
Way more than you would have expected. And I don't know if that's because of what you touched on earlier before we started recording, which is people sort of gather information for the showcase and try and predict what people will be on. So it might have been that those predictions yielded that Blue Black Terror was maybe well positioned to do well.
Yeah.
And prompted a lot of people to play it.
Yeah, potentially. I can definitely see that. It could also be the maybe, I don't know, maybe you don't even have time to look at the Saturday challenge. So it's a deck that basically its own worst enemy, and that's all it's kind of, its biggest problem is itself, depending on how draw. Like, it's very draw dependent. It can obviously just absolutely ruin itself by its flips. It can ruin itself by its all sorts of, like, the deck variants, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But when it does reasonably well, it definitely just gives it can give your opponent sometimes just a small window to answer, and it's like, if obviously there's only, at this point you need X card, and they can't play around the spell pierce or whatever, sometimes that's just game or counter spell or whatever. It's definitely and I think that's kind of what I was meaning by with the Bogles. They're both very similar. They are their own worst enemy. They mulligan themselves to death sometimes. They all that sort of stuff, and sometimes right time chainers can lose them the game, but also it can also like win them the game because they've now only got 3 draw steps to 8 cards to find a chainers or whatever, if you know what I mean. Gives them the smallest window to find the answer.
I find that both decks have sort of weird mana base issues as well.
Yeah.
For just being 2 colour decks.
Yeah.
Where Blue Black Terror's like so laden down with tapped lands. And then Bogles obviously runs hardly any tapped lands, but it sort of sometimes struggles to get its second colour on the go.
Yeah.
Which these Bogles decks that came first and second both had a one-off Cave of Temptation, along with a couple of Ash Barrens to fix the basic plains, basic forest mana base. Which seems like an interesting one. I imagine it's fairly easy to crack once you have sort of a Utopia Sprawl down as well. if you have to play the Ash Barons, you can play the Cave Late to get some at least coloured mana off that, I guess. And yeah, late game the counters aren't nothing. So interesting ad.
Yeah, it's kind of been in and out of Bogles for quite a while since it is usually, I've never seen it more than the one of. But I've definitely been killed by +1/+1 counters from my caves before. That is for sure. But Bogle's mana bases, I think, to be fair, it's like that's the biggest innovation for the deck nowadays. Is literally just the mana base. Like it's, are you running your type jewels? Are you running your thriving gates, like your thriving lands or whatever? Or are you running untapped lands and it's all Ash Barons and Cave of Temptations or what have you? So it's definitely still an unknown for the deck, and I think something like Slivers also kind of suffers from that as well. It must be just these two colour aggressive decks just struggle to find themselves with the mana base.
Another notable absence was Affinity. There was no Affinity in the top 10. There was no Affinity in the top 32 at all. Which is, very unexpected for an event of this caliber.
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, obviously, we don't really have like the percentages of like deck submissions and stuff. So it'd be really interesting to see how many people, when people do get access to them, how many people actually piloted Affinity, compared to obviously how many
and just missed on the top 32. Yeah.
But based on how many blue-black Terror teams, I can't imagine there's many Affinity anyways. They're just everyone was busy on the Terror plan.
And then another similar in that vein, Mono Red, nowhere near the top 10 once again. I think the first was 21st place. And again, there wasn't a huge amount. There was a couple of the culled off of BTE lists, and then a couple of the sort of more expected Cage Breaker lists, and then a couple of these Forge Chant to Burn lists. But yeah, nowhere near the top. Not even near the top 16 really. So a poor showing for Mono Red once again. Two bad challenges in a row.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't really know the exact time difference on these. Like, if one's in the morning and one's in the afternoon, or if they're in parallel or whatever. But you would at least think that some high representation, like if they're not in the challenge, there's maybe a high representation in the showcase for whatever. Yeah. But there just isn't.
I don't know if there was more in the top 64, but I imagine the sheer amount of Hydros and Blue Elemental Blasts with all the Terror and Fear knocking about probably kept the Mono Red down quite a lot. Yeah. Because all the decks are just stacked with Blue Elemental Blasts at the moment. Other than Gardens. It's a nice change.
I think though, as well, I do think that I think I'm touching on this on the Sunday, I believe. Yeah. But it's just that Gardens and like black based mid range decks have done well over the weekend overall, I would say. Yeah. And I do just think they're just really well positioned. Like the life gain along with Chainers is pretty solid against the like Pinger burn, which I would say arguably is the most common burn of the red deck at the moment.
Yeah, definitely.
And Ren's Resolve and Reckless Impulse just feel so bad. Well, not bad is probably not the best word, but they feel a lot more underwhelming when you aren't chaining them without a pinger. Without a pinger, they're definitely a lot worse. You're just kind of doing stuff, if that makes sense. So line it up with chainers off on their the Kessig Flame Breather or the Thermal Alchemist or what have you. It's just so much better than it has been previously, and then follow up with obviously the life gain the white deck's got, or the life gain the red deck's got, the green black deck's got.
I suppose something like Gardens as well can just compete with that kind of advantage with all the deadly disputes and stuff. Yeah. So you can just maintain the being ahead. Yeah. Also, both black-based mid-range decks, the black-white Ephemera and also Gardens, both finish usually with Avenging Hunter or an Initiative, which is also another thing that's really now harder for the red deck to take. Now it's sort of skewed away from Cold Offer, maybe. Yeah. It's interesting.
I definitely think they are pretty well positioned at the moment.
Yeah. So yeah, two challenges, one after the other, and both drastically different results.
Hmm.
Um, do you want to move on to the Sunday? Have you got anything else to add on the showcase?
No, it's just obviously just highlighting that obviously they are different results, but they are fairly similar in the sense that they are, as we've already touched on, absent of basically Infinity. We've got what, one in Saturdays, and then zero in the showcase, and then
Yeah.
no red anywhere. It
Yeah.
just, I think people have just chose to not lay down. That's for sure. So yeah, let's move on to Sunday with, again, I would still say another drastically different result. We have
Yeah.
first and second, we had Affinity and Mono Blue Fair. And third and fourth were both Black White Ephemerate decks. And 5 through 8, we had A Bogles, an Affinity, another Mono Blue Fair, and a Flickertron. And a couple of misses, which 9th and 10th, we had Bant Gates and just a normal white weaning or white aggro. So
Yeah. Another good showing from Bogles. Obviously missed out on the first Saturday challenge, but multiple top 8s in the showcase and another top 8 here. Yeah, I think at this point, obviously the representation isn't there, but I just think Bogles is probably a tier 1 deck now.
bold.
Like the just consistency of the results is better than basically anything that isn't sort of Mono Blue Fair.
Hmm?
Like you look back every week, it's either top 8 or very close to top 8.
Yeah.
Like if it had more pilots, I don't think there would be any question whether it was like one of the better decks in the format. But I think just the sheer lack of pilots makes it sort of a bit more disguised in that discussion.
I guess it's similar to like FAMs in that way. Like FAMs obviously generally gets low pilots and generally high representation for the most part, and has done for, I would like to say, for the past 3 years easily. Like you get consistently 1 FAMs in the top 16 and you've only got 4 pilots, and it's kind of it's similar vein, I guess. Low pilots and high results. It'd be interesting to see whether the same, like we'd have to obviously check over whether the same pilots or the same few pilots over the past few weekends. It's one thing that we definitely should look at to see if that is the case, because to see if it's a pilot thing or if it's just the deck performing.
Yeah.
If that makes
But yeah, I think it's sort of in a similar vein when you're talking about like how well positioned decks are and how they relate to each other. I think that the results that Mono Blue's putting up, again, just consistently week after week, and has the representation, it just seems like by far the best deck in the format at the moment.
Yeah.
Affinity and Mono Red definitely seem to have dropped back from competing for that slot, in my opinion.
I could see that. And I also think, though, it might not be the case. Like, it would be interesting to see if the mass representation of Red went back to being Kuldotha and just ignored Ren's Resolved existence.
Yeah.
Or maybe even just put it in the flex slots that were in Kuldotha before March of the Machines and stuff like that, and see how that would impact it, because maybe people are just blinded on Ren's Resolve more than...
Yeah, I can see that. That's possible. Because it just isn't putting up the results anymore that we had before Ren's Resolve. Yeah, and it would be interesting if maybe that effect, it's just 8 is too many. And if people are struggling to get round that.
It could definitely be a possibility, like that 8 is definitely too many, and especially for something like Kuldotha, or even and you put yourself in a position with the pinger burn that it just gets a bit lackluster without the pingers.
Yeah.
So I could definitely see that.
It's a cool way to look at it, to be fair. Yeah, so obviously these results, Affinity is a bit more back to where we would expect. A couple of copies, both in the top 8. Gone from basically the Saturday challenge, showcase challenge, and hardly represented in the other, but back to double top 8. So it's definitely not gone.
No, there'll be a long time before that's gone, especially if
Yeah.
nothing's happening or changing. But Infinity's definitely a solid. It is a solid deck, and obviously the pilots are generally well versed with it now, and there's a lot of variation as well, which I'm finding. I feel like the top two decks they've got identity problems at the moment. The top two, what I would class as the top two decks, like the tier 0 decks before Marching Machines, i.e. Affinity and Burn, or Affinity and Cold Author, have definitely got a big identity problem at the moment. But they don't know how they look or where they sit. And I don't really know why Affinity's got that issue, but unless it's just people just don't know what to tune it for to verse or beat, or if the Paupergeddon winning list, or not Paupergeddon winning list, but the Paupergeddon list that did really well also was a very off the wall, that it kind of went, whoa, do we need to reassess how we build Affinity, and that's kind of just not settled down yet, or what it is. It just definitely feels like they've both got identity issues at the moment.
Yeah, I think a big thing with the Affinity is, like, when you look how different all these top 8s look, it's sort of quite awkward to, like, plan what your Affinity deck is going to want to beat.
Yeah.
Obviously the core is just ridiculously strong, so the flex slots give you that extra percentage in the games that you'd maybe struggle with, and when all the top 8s in the field is that different, it's obviously really good for content and for playing different decks. But if you're just trying to beat a set field of top decks, it's pretty awkward.
Yeah, that's definitely for sure. It's because I also think there's obviously the shell, as you say, is really strong. So it is just finding that, like, where'd you take it from there, and it is a difficult one, because obviously as you say all these are different, so it's just it could be, but maybe they don't need to fight against anything. Like I feel like older Affinity didn't really, I wouldn't say it felt tuned to beat anything, but maybe everything was very beatable with the similar cards maybe at the time.
Yeah, I could see that.
So maybe people are trying to get too fancy with it, or maybe it just isn't. I don't know. I honestly, I don't have the answers, but I definitely do feel like something's different, and I can't put my finger on what it is.
But yeah, I think the biggest take from that is both Mono Red and Affinity don't seem to have a solidified list anymore.
Yeah.
They've went from basically being a list like Mono Blue that doesn't change, to every list you see has different cards in.
Yeah.
Or he's trying different numbers, or he's testing some sideboard cards in the main.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Definitely. I can see Tron's definitely done quite well over the weekend. We obviously Flickertron, that is, I guess I should specify. We obviously had one top one in the Saturday showcase and one here again, which not many pilots usually.
Yeah,
as well. So
I think that's the same here. There's very low representation, but just good results.
Yeah, the deck. Talking about putting sideboard cards in your main deck. This is the king deck for doing it. It's pretty much like 30 sideboard cards just in one with a bunch of teachings. So
yeah,
it's definitely a solid choice. I don't want to talk and bring too much attention to it, because people might start playing it, and that's my opinion on that deck. That is the world's worst deck to play against on Modo. That is for sure. But it is a consistently, I'd say it's in an okay position. It's definitely in a position to fight Affinity. It's definitely in a position to fight Red. It's in a reasonable position, I would say, to fight Mono Blue as well, if you know exactly how to tackle these matchups. And then it's quite well positioned at just doing its thing and doing it bigger and better than other decks to fight off the wall decks and like other mid-range decks. So I'm all for Tron in general being reasonable position, because they did unban map and things like that to kind of at least keep it somewhat playable.
Yeah.
And I like the random representations of different types of decks, but Flickertron or Magic Online with the clock seems to be doing reasonably well.
Have you got any other comments on the results from Sunday? Or do you want to move on to your shout-outs?
No, I've got no other comments. I guess I'll just touch on the shout-out. Won't like go into it too much, but I would just like to shout out Weber. Obviously, he featured in, I believe it was the Saturday challenge. He top 8'd. Yes, it was the Saturday challenge, and he was on Affinity, and he was previously in the, I think it was last week, so if not the week before, playing Terra, or like the top 16. So shout out to Weber, obviously PFP member, just representing, definitely.
Yeah, with different decks as well, so
Yeah.
pretty versatile.
The man definitely likes to brew as well, and he comes up with some absolutely wild engines and all sorts of different interactions. So you can definitely see this man absolutely adores Pauper, and it shows his knowledge. Top 8 in challenges, and also with the different brews he has on his he puts out. So
yeah, it is cool to see the people sort of in charge of the decision making are actually playing in the challenges and in leagues and playing consistently.
Yeah.
It's obviously a big confidence boost to everyone who plays the format, that we're probably in a good position, or at least the people in charge know what they're doing.
Yes, definitely. Definitely puts some sort of backing into whatever they say, because obviously you do see him here in challenges fairly consistently. So do you want to move on to deck highlights?
Yeah, fire away.
So my first deck choice that I would like to highlight is for the Saturday challenge, and it is the 10th place Familiars list, which is from GN42.
Once again,
he is here. It just felt right that we should at least highlight his deck. He's consistently shown in challenges, and with it being a little bit different to obviously the lists that is done well with over the past few weekends, I think it was nice to highlight it. And also, I do believe he is a regular listener to the podcast, so just say hi while we're here. But the deck's definitely interesting. It's different because it doesn't have Meeting of Minds, which I believe he went from 4 at the first time he did really well to going down to 2 copies like the week after, or the Sunday after, or whatever it was. And he's now just completely gone from the list. But I don't know if that could potentially be a nod to Fear. So I do believe that the Deep Analysis is generally the better option of draw spells against Fear, because obviously you can flashback it. You can usually cast it and flash it back in the same turn. So it's quite hard for them to keep up multiple counter spells to carry on, while you still get your card advantage.
Yeah.
But
even still, though, I guess it's still only a one-off.
Exactly. That was my next point. So it's definitely a weird one that overall the list is strange. Again, another thing I like to highlight is most of the time, as of recent history anyways, Seagate Oracle and the Modern Age usually take up the same slot. It's usually one or the other, but it seems to be more common now that they're running both. And I don't know if they just found out they're just both good enough to run, or what the reason is, if they just want to put stuff in the way for Fear or for Red or whatever the reason. I have no idea. I'm not a Familiars expert, but just noticing these differences is definitely interesting.
I think it's quite cool as well to see. Obviously, the last couple of times we've looked at his lists, he's been trialing new cards. So obviously, Meeting of Minds and the little 1/2 flash guide that gives Hexproof.
Oh, Cryptomancer.
And obviously those cards aren't present at all in this. So I'm assuming he's come to the conclusion that they weren't where he wanted to be. But it's just cool to see that process obviously play out in the results. Yeah.
And then the other thing, I guess, to bring attention to is usually they run some amount of prohibits and like a counter spell just as a hard counter, because when you get the lock going, you can obviously just keep flashing back a counter spell, if you know what I mean. And when they're down to 0 cards, you can just ephemera counter spell the card they draw, rinse and repeat over and over, and lock you and kill you with a Muldrifter. But that seems to be obviously gone from the list, and is running a Remove Soul instead, which is another interesting choice. And only 1 Prismatic Strands as well in the entire 75, which again, I'm sure I'm used to seeing at least 2 somewhere in the 75, like a 1-1 split or what have you, which is definitely interesting.
Yeah, the remove souls are cool one. I guess depending what you're wanting to counter, it's a hard counter. If you're obviously only fearing creatures, it's solid. It obviously has the benefit of like prohibit, where off a familiar it only costs one, or off a Karoo you can cast it, whereas counterspell you can't.
Yeah.
But it very much feels like like metagame choice.
Yeah.
Over the counterspell.
Yeah.
Which is cool to see.
No, definitely.
I think if he had ran it in the showcase, it probably would have been the perfect card with all the terror knocking about.
Yeah,
you pretty much just want that remove soul.
Yeah, that is definitely for sure. But after that, everything else looks fairly stock, by the remove soul in the sideboard. Everything's fairly stock in the side, I think. By the looks of it, I'm used to seeing some number of all of these cards, as in 2 Dust to Dusts, 2 Last Breaths, 4 Hydroblast, 2 Revokes, 1 Dawnbringer, 2 Negates, and a Destroy Evil. All are generally seen somewhere in the sideboard for familiars.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, definitely shout out to JN and changing it up with all sorts of different familiars lists.
Yeah,
so
definitely. So for my pick, it's basically 2 decks. It's the 2 Bogles decks that came 11th and 12th. From Las Vegas Chaos and Y Principe.
Sure.
Just they're very similar. The main decks are basically plus or minus a Ledgewalker or a Sentinel's Eyes. One's on 2 Ledgewalkers, one's on 3, and one's on 1 Eyes, one's on 2.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the deck just seems stupidly powerful at the moment. It just seems to get the results, despite the lack of representation. And it just seems to have the tools to basically plow through any deck in the format.
Yeah, it's definitely a solid one. I've got, I can't really, looking at these lists, as you say, the only difference is I can understand potentially the change in the Ledgewalker, as I do think it can be a liability sometimes, being 2 mana, being able to be blocked by fairies or core skyfishers. So there's definitely places where it can be a bit weak. So I kind of do understand somewhat the reason for taking out the Ledgewalker, but I guess you've got to put something else in. I guess Eyes is probably the best thing to put in. I guess.
It's there's not much space other than either Sentinel's Eyes or Cartouche, really, because every other aura you basically stacked on 4.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can see obviously the 1 less creature is probably a bit more, makes the mulligans a bit more awkward.
Yeah.
Because you find those hands with only 10 creatures, you can sometimes just not have any. But yeah, it's definitely a deck that's doing really well at the moment, and I just felt it was definitely worth highlighting.
Yeah, definitely. I do also like in the 11th place list, the Las Vegas Chaos. I like the 2 Vitality Charms in the sideboard. My brief playing of Bogles, I was a big fan of Vitality Charm. Just it does quite a lot for the deck, which I was quite surprised at.
Yeah, I think that obviously for anyone who doesn't know what it does, it's a green mana instant that either puts a 1/1 green insect into play, gives a creature +1/+1 and trample, or regenerates a beast. The regenerate a beast isn't really relevant.
It can regenerate a Bogle.
I stand corrected. Apparently, Slippery Bogle is a beast.
As I said, it does a lot for the deck.
So all mods are pretty relevant. The 1/1 insect protects you against edicts. The trample is obviously huge if you don't have a trampler, but you have a big guy with a couple of ethereal armors. You can get him through. And yeah, the beast regenerate your Slippery Bogle.
There you go. But yeah, it does a lot for the deck, because obviously the insect protects against edict while also being if they tap out or whatever and you've got nothing on board, it's like a surprise. Here's a 1/1 suited up, kill you.
Some enchantments on it. Yeah.
So and obviously, as you say, the trample is just an additional Rancor or Armadillo Cloak effect, and then regenerate a beast comes up somewhat Not very often, but it does come up. So definitely, I definitely like the Bogles deck, and I think a lot of the innovation is in the sideboard at the moment. I think with the different slots of whatever you want to verse.
Yeah, obviously there was those 2 slots in the main, but they're just sort of neither here nor there really. The rest of the mains are identical. Both with the Cave of Temptation, 1 Cave of Temptation, 2 Ash Barons. And then as you say, the sideboard, there's a lot of flex in the sideboard. The sideboards are very similar but have different numbers. The 12th place has an extra Flare and Pain and an extra Standard Bearer instead of the 2 Vitality Charms. Whereas the 11th place also has a Gut Shot instead of 1 Spirit Link.
Yeah. So I guess the Gut Shot, I would guess, is more for Fear to push through a spell, and the guy that wanted more Standard Bearers was expecting Mirrors or Gates a lot more.
Yeah, what I found when I was playing Bogles previously was the Gut Shot was also a nice out to Standard Bearer in the mirror.
Oh, of course.
Otherwise, you just lose.
Yeah, of course. So,
if you time it right, obviously.
Yeah, definitely solid.
So if we move on to the Showcase Challenge decks. So the deck I've chosen, which luckily I got it in first, is Poison Storm. That was 16th place by Renan. I've definitely chosen Teasdale's pick here.
Yeah, you definitely
have. But it was just the deck's too sweet not to mention. We've both been following and brewing with the deck since obviously the cards came out in All Will Be One. And obviously Callie's done loads with the deck as well.
Yeah.
This list in particular, it just looked like a really clean list. Everything was basically maxed to 4. Bar I think a 1 of serrated arrows in the main, which is just a nice sort of catch-all answer. But everything else was maxed to 4. And 1 of Swamp, 1 of Forest, and 5 Islands for the basics. Which with the 4 Thurston Roots just makes your mana base a lot more solid. Obviously you've played this quite a bit, and I know you had some trouble with the mana base, so hopefully something like this maybe helps that issue out.
Yeah, I was playing like the older lists, I would say, like the blue-black ones, playing just the Weather the Storms, really. And then... But this deck is sweet to start with, and I'm really happy that it's finally done reasonably well in a challenge, a showcase challenge to say as well. But maximising out on 4, and what the decks seem to... the I don't want to say the older list, because there's no real, list being defined yet, but what the list seemed to be doing previously was having a couple copies of Thurston Roots and potentially 3 prologues instead of 4, and then maybe even some amount of Vivisurging inside, so they weren't maxing out on everything, and then that created 4 to 6 slots, which a lot of them seem to have interaction, either in form of serrated arrows or in forms of
Bring the Ending and stuff a Night with Affliction.
Yeah, I can't remember what's the name of the red threshold, wrath.
Oh, Swell and Sandstorm.
Swell and Sandstorm, that's the one. So, but this deck just went absolute. I am going to do my thing, and I'm going to do it really consistently. And this deck is just a blast to play, as well. It's even fun. It's even more fun to play in paper as well, which I can't say is very true for a lot of decks. But it is definitely a blast.
Yeah, it's just a very clean main deck. The sideboard has the interaction that obviously you had in your main deck when you were playing it. 3 Bring the Endings, 3 Annoyance, a couple more Serrated Arrows, 3 Moments Peace, and 4 Hydroblasts.
Can't leave home without them.
A pretty compact sideboard.
Yeah.
There's not a load of 1-ofs, it's all fairly stable numbers, but just a sweet one to mention.
Yeah, another thing that I am quite surprised at, and I don't know how, and it kind of brings on to the last point before moving on, I guess, is the deck. I don't know how well this deck is going to do moving forward, because I do think Weather the Storm is a good answer for the general field. Like, it obviously does well against like Affinity, it stops them killing you. Obviously, it's good against Burn, all that sort of stuff. But the deck's recently, like, it's pretty badly positioned against Fae. So, with how popular Fae is in general, I'm surprised how well it did from the get-go. Yeah. And I'm surprised, obviously, how it's going to do moving forward. But
I think on a similar point, if something like Boggles picks up, Boggles can just easily like one hit through a Weather the Storm, like without much consideration. But yeah, I can see that happening. Hopefully it doesn't, because it's a sweet one to see. But
yeah, it is definitely a fun one. It's even fun to play against. I have no qualms with dying to this at all. So definitely a sweet one, and I'm happy at least one of us showcased it, even if you did steal it from us or whatever. But I'm not salty. It's all good. Anything else to say about this sweet deck, or?
No, I'm happy for you to move on to your replacement deck that's not Poison Stone.
Yeah, I will move on to... I don't want to say a worse deck by any stretch of the means, but it's definitely not as exciting to me. But it's, again, another similar shout-out. It is the 20th place deck from Selka, or Selkas. I used to call him Selka HS, and I don't know why, because I always think it's like someone's put Hearthstone on there.
Hearthstone Pro.
Yeah. But Selka... really popularized Corgate back when it was like very early on. He's like one of the original, not the original pilot, but he definitely was popularizing it back when like Turbo Initiative was a thing and all that sort of stuff. So I have seen this list quite a lot, and it's a fairly stock list from him, and he just keeps tearing up with it. He does really, really consistently, really, really well. Obviously, a lot of the gate decks you see, they'll put like Smash to Dust in, or they'll put other red cards like Bolt or whatever in the deck, but he's just rocking. He's playing the red splash, but it's like 2 Fire and Ice in the main and then 4 red Elemental Blast in the side. And then after that, you're basically looking at a bunch of 4-ofs almost, like with a couple of Shaven. He's got 3 Dawnbringer Clerics, 3 Preordains, and then 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Fire and Ice. It's like a very clean looking list.
Yeah, I think seeing a gate deck that is bold enough to just go 2 colours when you've basically got all the fixing you want. It's definitely a cool way to do it. Just stacked on 4 Azorius Guild Gate, because he only needs the blue-white.
Yeah.
And again, the sideboard is basically compacted to what it wants to be. There's 3 Dust to Dust, 4 Bebs, 4 Rebs, 3 Relics, and then I guess a 1-of Flex Dispel. But it's obviously just aimed at the blue decks, Affinity, the red decks, and Graveyard. Yeah,
and it definitely seems a fairly solid list. Like, obviously, you've got the 4 Modern Age with quite a lot of Graveyard, like a fair bit of Graveyard interaction with, like, obviously Prismatic Strands and Sacred Cat.
Yeah.
Not too much in terms of removal. Obviously, you've got 2 Fire or Ice and then 4 Journeys. But again, I guess you don't really need it when you're bashing him with some Squadron Hawks.
Yeah.
But 4 Prismatic Strands, 4 Sacred Cat seems to be okay, I would guess, fairly well positioned against the red decks. And then you clean up with the rest.
Yeah, I get when you're bringing in 4 Bebs as well, I don't think you have to worry as much. Obviously, the 2 Spell Pierce, now that the red decks are trying to run the 4 Reckless and the 4 Rens Resolve, like the Spell Pierce is just really good against red at the moment.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely just a sweet one. Just want to obviously showcase Selka, because he has been doing really well with this sort of deck. He seems to stop picking it up when he gets bored of winning with it. Seems to be the consensus. So I'm quite glad he decided to pick it back up again, because it is a sweet one. I do like Colgate, and I like obviously the gate decks. Any gate decks is a pretty decent one for sure.
Do you want to move on to your choice?
Yeah. Moving on to the Sunday challenge. we have basically chose the 4th place. I guess we could also talk about the 5th place really as well, but mainly the 4th place list of Black White Ephemera. I really do like these sort of like Black White initiative lists with Vampire Sovereigns and Goliath Paladins and things. So it is basically, it's fairly stock, I would say. It's running like 4th Raven Inspectors, the 4 Spirit Companions, the 4 Inspiring Overseers, 3 Core Skyfishers, which I think's fairly stock. As I say, I don't know the ins and outs of this list, of this archetype. And it's only running 2 Goliath Paladins, which really stood out to me. But then it's went up to 4 Vampire Sovereigns. Usually, from memory, they seem to be the other way around.
Yeah, from what I've seen, it's generally 4 Paladins and 2 Sovereigns.
Yeah.
But I do like the more heavier split on the Sovereign. It seems like a cool way to go about it, especially if you're expecting a lot of fear. Obviously the flying gives you a blocker, and the initiative can be a bit of a liability against that deck.
Yeah. It's also a good like finisher as well, because you're running 4 Ephemerates like these decks do.
Yeah.
It kills them fairly quickly. Like just attack them for 3 Ephemerate, and then the rebound is quite a lot of damage. It's surprisingly amount of damage. But yeah, the list is definitely a solid one. We have a interesting Vendetta in the main, which again is another solid one.
Yeah, it's a cool sort of answer in a deck where you run quite a lot of tapped lands. Just a 1 mana early answer. Obviously losing 1 life to a 1 combat mana cost or 1 toughness creature. Even I guess 2 life if you're killing us with spear is not that big of a deal. And just being it obviously can't kill black creatures, but there's not a huge amount of black you want to kill. You don't really want to be Vendetta and Gurmag Anglers and taking 7. Yeah, it's a cool sort of tech piece as the 5th hard removal spell.
Yeah, it seems to have got a 4th copy of Chainers looking at this list to run the Vendetta, and I can definitely, as you say, the tap land thing seems to be a real pro to playing it, because obviously you go tap land, so you can easily cast it on 2.
Yeah,
and not lose much. It's
a sort of card that reminds me of like the Ghastly Demise slot. But obviously early on, Ghastly Demise is a lot harder to turn on.
Yeah.
So yeah, this just seems pretty ideal for this format at the moment. Just slowing your opponent down for only 1 mana, and then being able to establish both your mana base, because you can play tap land into tap land and still have removal, and then just remove their guy end of turn and just play a creature as a follow-up. Just seems pretty solid.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems the deck seems pretty overall well positioned against, I would say, whichever form of red it gets thrown at. With obviously its life gain is predominantly in its lands, with the Scoured Baron, 2 Crossroads, and 3 Basilicas to return them, along with, you've obviously got the Vampire Sovereigns, which we touched on earlier, and then 3 copies of Dawnbringer Cleric. With 4 Ephemerates, does actually end up adding up.
It's not the biggest deal to start killing bigger stuff late game if you need to.
So definitely a solid one, and the sideboard for itself looks fairly, I would say, as I would expect. It's nothing too out the question. There's 4 Dust to Dust, 4 Revoke, 2 Relics, 1 Dawnbringer Cleric, 1 Arms of Adar, 2 Arashing Clerics, and 1 Celestial Flare. I guess the only thing I would consider there is the Celestial Flare over the 4th Chainer's Edict, personally. But that's kind of the one that I wouldn't really expect. But I guess when a deck like this is clogging up the board, like it does with Thrabins, Dawnbringers, Spirit Companions, and all that sort of stuff, like the Celestial Flare, I imagine gets a lot more. You kind of want to look at it a bit more, because obviously the Gates decks will just be attacking with their 1 big gate. The Bogles players will just be attacking with their 1 big Bogle. So
yeah, even though they might have a guy back to protect against Chainers, they're probably not going to send in a 1/1 that's just going to get eaten by you.
Exactly.
Raven Inspector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's I can see the reasoning behind it, and it's definitely a solid choice.
It's definitely a sideboard that looks scared of Affinity.
Yeah, that
with
is.
the 4 dust to dust and 4 revoke existence.
Yeah, and I can definitely see the 4 revokes and the 1 celestial flare. It's definitely died to Bogles a few times.
Yeah, yeah.
So that is for sure. I always do like these decks with the core Skyfishers as well, running 1 Omen of the Dead, especially being black-white, like black based. Yeah. Just being able to just go Skyfisher, Skyfisher, Skyfisher. Every time you kill them, they just keep coming back.
Yeah, it's surprising how good Omen of the Dead is with Skyfisher.
Mm.
Like it doesn't sound that great. Although you can rebuy your guy and then play him and get it back and then rebuy a different guy, but it does just add up. It's basically sort of Squadron Hawk with Skyfishers.
Yeah,
they just never they never run out.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, definitely a solid list. I really do like the black-white ephemera decks to see. They're not really the funnest to play in my personal experience. But I do like Vampire Sovereign and Ephemerate, so thought I'd definitely highlight this deck because it is definitely a sweet one to see. And what is your choice for the Sunday deck?
So my choice is from a player that we basically covered similar list last week, but I just thought his changes to the deck were interesting and were worth going over. So it's Luffy's list, which is Affinity. But if you remember last week, he had stuff like Negate and Breath Weapons in the main. He's completely moved away from that and gone towards a sort of more old school Affinity card in Somber Hoverguard. Which is a 6 mana, 5 and a blue, for a 3/2 flyer, with Affinity. So it just seems like a pretty decent guy in a field full of fear. I guess it replaces the Frogmite slot, but has flying to block all the 1/1s. So obviously still tuning an Affinity deck for the field, but this is quite an interesting choice. Eating fairies through brine barrows as well, and being able to hit quite a fast clock seems like a solid option.
Yeah, it's definitely a good choice. I really do like Somber Hoverguard. I think we were joking about this, like obviously just talking generally that we were saying like we want Affinity to bring back Somber Hoverguard a few months back or something, but and now here he is. Luffy has answered our prayers. When you actually see it in a deck list, it definitely looks a lot better because obviously, as you say, it's easily eats up a lot of fairies. It's hard for them to deal with, and it's not like being only effectively. Sounds weird, but only 1 more mana than Frogmite in terms of the Affinity side of things. Like you only need 5 artifacts as opposed to 4. Actually makes it relatively easy to play, and does a lot more.
You get the bonus off Reckoner's Bargain as well. You're getting 6 life instead of 4 that you'll be getting from Frogmite. It's a lot faster clock than Frogmite.
Yeah.
And can get through a lot more stored boards.
Yeah. I had it come up with recently in testing this Jeskai Affinity deck where one of the players was literally just Somber Hoverguard and disputing them and gaining 6, and as weird as it sounds, gaining 6 was just obviously 2 to 3 more turns of me attacking with a core Skyfisher.
I guess its biggest downside is that it's not an artifact itself.
Yeah.
But that also sort of functions as an upside because it can't get dust to dusted. So you've got a threat that is a decent threat that you can always Blood Fountain back.
Yeah.
Because it's not getting exiled like your Mirror Forces. But yeah, it was a cool sort of addition to the deck. He's still got his Nihil Spell Bombs in the main. The breath weapons and negates are still there, but they're just now in the sideboard. The sideboard, pretty much what you'd expect. 8 blasts, 4 red, 4 blue, an extra chainers, an unexpected fangs, 3 negates, 2 breath weapons. I think as well, another difference from his list last week is last week he didn't have makeshift munitions in the main, or possibly not at all in the 75. I'm not 100% on that.
Be an interesting thing to
it is
not
returned
happen.
Here.
Yeah, I can imagine that. If he didn't have it in the list, I imagine it's a card that generally just gives them the longevity to kind of get through those final points of damages.
Yeah.
So it definitely seems free enough to include. But I do like the Somber Hoverguard, and I do think it does the deck now, especially going towards, as Luffy's built it, with the going towards the spell bombs and away from the stars, and obviously going in more like most affinities do. They have like 3 blood fountains most of the time. You're not really having the issue with it not being an artifact, and also having Kenku and Gear Seeker not being artifacts as well. Like, you're not really losing out that much.
No, you have more than enough, really.
Yeah. Is 20 lands stock as well? That's another thing. I don't know how. I haven't looked at lists in detail, but I
think it's fairly stock. I'm not sure on the numbers. I believe the 4 seats probably have gone up, like, for the Hoverguard and the Gear Seekers. But yeah, I think 20 lands is fairly stock from what I remember. It's usually just the furnaces, the seat, and the vaults that sort of tweak, depending on what you're running.
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, it was definitely a solid list overall. Obviously, Thoughtcast getting outshone as per usual in Affinity nowadays.
Which is a shame.
Yeah. Divination is not as good as Ancestral Recall, clearly.
No. So do you want to move on to our recap from last week? Of what we predicted?
Yeah, definitely.
So our first one was the Affinity lists will follow Luffy's lead. That is to say, they'll be tuned more to the metagame and less from sort of a stock list. This one is a bit hard to tell because there was really, really low representation of Affinity in all 3 challenges. So I'm not 100% on this one. Obviously, we've just spoken then about the addition of Somber Hoverguard, which is a cool thing to see, but I don't think really we can tell if they have changed to follow a more tuned version.
Yeah, it is an interesting one because obviously they're not really... The tuned lists aren't really there because there's no real representation, and then also Luffy's obviously changed his list to target almost a different metagame. So they are obviously Luffy is tuning his to beat the metagame, but others haven't really followed on from what his was last week, and neither has himself. If you know what I mean, there is like like the lists, like Hamuda's list, which is in 3rd place on the Sunday, followed suit somewhat with obviously having the spell bombs main, and the chainers main, that sort of thing. So like he's keeping some sort of, I'm going to tune it to beat a metagame instead of like having the chromatic stars and all that sort of stuff. But
it's back on. Well, it has 2 stars in.
Yeah.
And 2 rebukes instead of like the breath weapons and negates or other sort of more focused cards.
Yeah. So
yeah, I think that one's probably a hard one to tell at the moment. But I might leave that in for next week's recap and just look at that one again.
Yeah.
To see if we can get any more from it.
Yeah.
The second one was the increase of black-white, which was one of yours, which definitely seems to be occurring from what we were expecting and what we were experiencing the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think it was only like a couple of copies in the last week's episode. There wasn't many, and it ended up obviously taking the win on the Sunday, I believe. But now, as you can see, we have a 13th place, a 17th place, a 19th on the Saturday, and then 2 top 8s and the 27th in the Sunday. And that's obviously not including anything that we can't see, like out of the...
outside the top 32.
Yeah. So I definitely think... I didn't think it would put up as good of results as it did. That's for sure. Because this and Gardens definitely had a fairly solid weekend.
Yeah, the double top 8 and then the top 16 plus almost top 16. Yeah, really, really solid results. From a deck that was pretty low. Obviously, it got that win last week, but apart from that, there was not much of it about.
Yeah, I think obviously this deck's kind of like floated in and out of existence for quite a while. Obviously, originally coming from like a Warplow kind of flicker deck. Obviously, it definitely has evolved from there. But I think people who like this deck, they like to play this sort of archetype. They just kind of sit and wait for it to put up a result, and it's kind of like, oh, it's actually reasonably positioned now. Pick it back up, because it is a solid one at the moment. I would say.
Yeah. Our third expectation from last week was that Burn would start to solidify its list. Obviously, quite the opposite from that's happened from the copies that are there. Obviously, low quality of results. There was none in any of the top 8s, I don't think. And pretty far from the top 16s, but all the lists were different. Like, they were playing Forge Chanter, they were playing Flamebreaker, they were playing Prophet, they were playing Cult Offer and Burning Tree. So that's just sort of the exact opposite of what we expected.
Yeah.
Burn is still very much up in the air. No one knows what to play, what numbers to play, what version to play.
Yeah. It's definitely went the other way, because it kind of was going in one direction over the past few weeks. It was very much Cold Authors taking a downturn. There was a couple of Cold Authors, and there was a couple of Pinger Burn in like the first chance that we covered, and then it kind of stemmed away to being almost 0 Cold Authors, like maybe 1 copy here and there, to then we were thinking the next one I think was all Pinger Burn. There was like with the odd, I think it had Burning Tree as I guess as like a one of, and then we expected it to solidify from there because that was kind of how it was trending, and then it just went completely the opposite and just took a back turn. Which is interesting.
And not put any results up to boot.
Yeah.
Which is another sort of unexpected. If you'd asked me to bet on the results, I would have guessed there was probably a burn in the top 16 of every challenge this week, and there was none.
And you gained an extra challenge to bet on as well, and you just didn't have
exactly. Yeah.
But
so that one didn't play out very well. Our final expectation from last week was that Tron would see an uptick.
Yeah.
Which sort of happened, sort of didn't, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of stayed very similar, I guess, but I guess it kind of looks like it's took an uptick in terms of it done reasonably well, like it has been, but obviously there's been an extra challenge where it's also done reasonably well. So it kind of looks like it's, do you know what I mean? I would kind of say it hasn't, it's kind of done the same. It's just been a good pilot or a good couple of pilots, and they've kind of just taken people at time with it.
Obviously, in the showcase, there was a 6th place and a 15th place, and on the Sunday, there was a 5th place.
Yeah.
So, yeah, decent results. Arclid 21 continuing to do that Tron grind and putting up results most weeks.
Clearly, there's nothing better to do but click.
Yeah, not really an increase in pilots, but just an increase in visible, decent results.
Yeah. So I definitely say it wasn't really an uptick as such, but it was definitely still continues to do as it was doing.
And then now for our expectations of how Pop will shake out for next week. My first one that is hopefully the sheer diversity that we've got from these 3 top 8s will continue. It feels like we've got one deck that's very much above everything else in mono blue. But it does seem like there's a lot of decks on just that step below all fighting it out, which is a really cool place to see the format.
Yeah.
It obviously would be better if mono blue was brought back down into line with everything else. But yeah, as you can see from the diversity of the top eights, it's definitely not in a bad place.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely agree with that. And I think previously as well, with obviously having, I would like to say, 2 decks that were on that top pedestal, being Affinity and Red. Like, you still had a huge number of, just that step below, and if not the step below that, quite a lot of diverse decks. And I think the good thing is about Mono Blue, Affinity and Red, which may not be so, like, a good opinion for a lot of people, I guess, is that they are very targetable.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to make sure you can beat Red, yes, you can probably dedicate about 10 sideboard slots and you'll probably beat Red. And same is true for pretty much any of these decks.
Yeah, I think that in itself may be one of the reasons why Red has been doing so bad in this week in particular. Like, you look at the top 32s and every other deck has 4 or 5 or 6 Hydroblasts in its sideboard. But swinging the other way, because the mono red representation was so poor in these 3, people might start to take those out as they're not really as needed. Like, there's nothing else you're fighting against with Hydroblasts and Blue Elemental Blasts. There's mono red and that's basically it.
Yeah, pretty much. You've got the odd red Elemental Blast you're trying to counter, but you're not really doing anything else with that.
So yeah, I can definitely see those numbers coming down and then making way for when the mono red list sort of decides what it wants to be doing for that deck to come back a bit more.
Yeah, I can definitely, like, it makes sense that it's more susceptible to like Hydro and Beb as well. Like, as I've said quite a few times in this episode, is that Kessig Flamebreaver is just like if you answer that Flamebreaver, it just makes the deck not fall apart, but look less menacing.
Yeah.
Like, hitting Bolt isn't as scary when you're taking 3 as opposed to 4. Or hitting that Lava Dart is just anemic. You know what I mean? You're sacking them out to deal 2.
Yeah, rather than 4 for 1 mana.
Yeah. So I can definitely see it. But then, again, that also makes me think why all the black decks are also really good and, like, are getting a better position now. Because the Chainer's Edict gets much better against Pinger Storm. Because
true.
Every single creature you want a Chainer's Edict. Like, you wouldn't be upset if you hit a Swift Spear, you wouldn't be upset if you hit a Thermo, you wouldn't be upset if you hit a Flamebreaver. And there's no Epicures either in most lists.
Yeah, for chaps.
So I can definitely see why that's definitely, like, black-based mid-range decks with Chainer's Edict have definitely taken uptick, and you can definitely see that. But I do agree. I hope the diversity definitely continues, because it is nice to see all sorts of different
very
decks.
good to see. What is your first prediction for next week?
I like to go. I like to go off the wall. So my prediction is Black-White Pestilence. Not even Pestilence will appear as a copy of a card. I'm talking the archetype. Black-White Pestilence will make a top 32 appearance in one of the challenges. Just
how have we got there?
Well, to be fair, the reason is what I'm thinking is the black decks or the black-based mid-range decks are reasonably well positioned. You've obviously got Gardens, you've got Black-White Ephemerates. They're all reasonably well because Chainers is doing well. The tap lands with Life Gain are doing okay. They're also really good because they've got quite a lot of high mana costs, so it makes Fear a bit worse. So they can't really. So it's much harder for them to counter 2 Goliath Paladins or 2 Avenging Hunters or a Vampire Sovereign and a Goliath Paladin for consecutive turns.
Yeah.
So then my next leap is the best way for Black-White Ephemerate to beat Black-White Ephemerate is go bigger. And Pestilence gives you that inevitability to go bigger. It is a win con. That's my logic. There you go. Mic drop.
Definitely an interesting take.
I'm not holding out much hope, but
No.
I'm making one leap, and then I'm making another leap, and then I'm getting 2 completely different answers, and that answer is Pestilence.
I honestly can't remember the last time I seen a Pestilence deck. Never mind in in an event, just in general. But yeah, it would be interesting to see. But as you say, I wouldn't hold that much hope either.
I wouldn't bet on it. I definitely wouldn't take any bets on it, but that's what I'm going for. And also, there's a lot of decks with like main deck Dawnbringer Cleric too, so it's like not like it's so you've immediately got an answer for your Pestilence. You're not even boarding for it, but that's all I'm saying. It was either that or Tortured Existence, and I thought Tortured Existence was a bit too far.
You save that one for next week.
So what's yours?
My next one is less exciting, and it's sort of something we did touch on in that first prediction. Is that the format will shift more towards hate and mono blue, and sort of back off on the hate and the mono red with the reduction of Hydroblasts, and the increase in sort of the standard cards you have to hit mono blue, like the breath weapons and Pyroblasts and such. Basically, just if you look at the results, it doesn't really look like it makes much sense to be playing Hydros and Bebs. Whereas there's loads of Terror, so the Pyroblasts get better. There's also loads of mono blue, so you've got double duty on your Pyroblasts. And the cards that also hit on Fae are decent against. So if you're playing like Electric, you're obviously good against Bogles and such as well. So the cards that hate that deck just seem a lot better positioned at the moment than just the Hydroblasts that are essentially doing nothing most games.
Yeah, it seems hard to justify 8 Hydroblast effects against a deck that's clearly not this week, especially, and not really on last week on Sunday either, has put up that many results. So it definitely seems to think like, why you're justifying all these sideboard slots.
Yeah, especially when you go like 4+. It doesn't seem to make much sense now. Now we have this information from these 3 challenges.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that does pay off. But I think if it was me playing in the challenge next week, I probably would have hardly any mono red head. You can still pack Hydroblast, but I'd probably be on 2 or 3. I would guess.
I think it depends on the deck. To be fair, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, I think you can justify toning it down potentially a little bit. Yeah. So that is for sure, especially if it's in favour for mono blue sideboard slots. That's for sure. Yeah. My last one's kind of similar, to be fair, in some way, but it's more on the mono blue side of things. I think mono blue, as we've seen a little bit in some of these lists have started to run like Spire Golem and such. So they'll become a bit more like less copy and paste. There's the odd list here with like 1 copy of Spire Golem or all that sort of stuff, or 2 here and there. And I just think they're going to move away from the copy and paste that we've seen, where basically the 75 is the exact same. You've seen a lot of people testing in leagues with like Cryptomancer, Smoke Shroud, putting Force Spike back in. That's the Stompy special. That is for sure. And obviously Spire Golem's really good at the moment. When obviously
you've froze again, T-Still. Yeah, you're back now.
So
you said Stompy special and then you froze.
So I think going back to Spire Golem, now that Galv Blast's on a like down take, all sorts have been an actual reasonable threat, and having stuff in the sideboard like Echo and Truth and like Curfew, I guess, for Bogles, instead of the normal 75 that we've had of like 8 Hydroblasts and 7 Affinity like Annuls or whatever it was, I think it's probably the best idea, because you can then now tune your deck to beat the hate that you're expecting and also target something else. Because Affinity's on the down tick, you're going to want to fight the mirror more, so like potentially even like stuff like Gutshot.
I think that's where the Spire Golems probably come in pretty clutch.
Yeah.
I think the Dissonance list from Sunday showcases this pretty well in the main deck. It doesn't really follow it in the sideboard, as it's got the 6 Annul effects, 6 blast effects. But in his main deck, he's got no Brine Barrows, and instead he's got 4 Spire Golems. Yeah. Obviously, really good in the mirror. and he's cut the snaps as well for bind the monsters.
Yeah.
So it's just a very, obviously not very different, but a different enough take on the Mono Blue Fair list that makes it quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I have on good authority that Stompy has told me that bind the monster is very good in the mirror. So
Yeah, I
definitely,
can see that.
definitely nodding for a nod for the mirror with the 4 Spiegel and 4 bind. So
Yeah. You don't want to really be giving them back their the ninjas and the fairy seers.
So definitely a solid one. And also like the sideboard, it's still slightly interesting. You've got like a Viridian longbow, right, which is a bit off the wall for me, but I don't know how
I guess
common
that
that
again
is.
in the mirror, if you can resolve it, it's probably pretty gas.
Yeah.
If you can get it on one of your guys in the mirror, you can go uptown.
Yeah. So I can definitely see them just adapting somewhat. It might even next week. It might be something that we like revisit not just next week but the week after. Depending on obviously how your mono red shift the hate between shifting the hate turns. So like I can definitely see that being the case. That these two sort of kind of slowly move away from it. So we'll definitely see how it goes, because I think Mono Blue is definitely the deck to beat, for sure.
Oh yeah, sure. Definitely. Mint, is that it for today?
That is it for this episode. You got anything else? No?
No, I'm good.
So guys, this has been Casting Commons. We are the place to be whenever you want to hear anything Pauper related, that is for sure. So we'll see you guys next time, and don't forget, stay hydrated.
See ya.